Thanks everyone for coming in. My name is V. Sanchez. I am one of two affordable housing policy managers at Empower Missouri. Today we are doing our Friday forum on tenant unions. Super excited about that. So what we'll be hearing, and if we could advance to the next slide, Sarah. What we'll be hearing is like a brief introduction on tenant unions, and we'll definitely be hearing about like tenant power. We'll be hearing from New York State Tenants and Neighbors, who they are, what their mission is, a little, history about their organization, and the organizational structure and strategy that they use in their organizing and what they're currently organizing to win. We'll also be hearing a deeply impacted tenant leader's housing story, why she chooses to build power with her neighbors, and her bold vision for housing that she has for herself and her community. And we're really hoping that together during this session, we'll be building knowledge together around this topic. We want our participants to share and explore ideas around tenant organizing and what that could look like in their communities, or even start kind of like jogging some ideas about what types of policies they would like to see, won in their communities through tenant power. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. First, we have Abby Ang. She is the Policy and Communications Coordinator at New York State Tenants and Neighbors. She first joined them as a community organizer, working closely with tenant associations to build tenant power, preserve affordable housing, and advocate for tenant rights and protections. Prior to joining Tenants and Neighbors, she reported on housing justice issues with Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Neighborhood News Service, both local publications based where she grew up in Wisconsin. And then our second speaker will be Sheena Morrison. She is a resident of New York City and one of the co-presidents of the Tenant Association Board of her building in Central Harlem. She started organizing and ran to be the Tenant Association president because of questionable practices of the current management company and its predecessors and the owners who continues to compromise tenant health and safety. She currently works with nonprofit arts organization that champions equitable access to art education in city schools. All right, thank you so much both for being here. I'm going to start our kind of, this conversation with relational questions. For folks in the chat, if you could kind of type in there, what kind of housing issues do you see in your communication in your community, and what do you wish housing was like in your community? And we'll just kind of unpack a couple of those. Questions were, what kind of housing issues do you see in your community? And what do you wish housing was like in your community? And if a few of you would rather just, oh, okay. So Amber Smith says out of control rents. Yeah, definitely. I see that a lot. Well, I mean, I think we're seeing that everywhere, right? And honestly, that is like a huge reason that we need to see more folks build on tenant power. So let's go over just a couple of quick tenant union 101s. So tenant unions are renter-led organizations that advocate for tenant rights. Tenants are pretty vulnerable. Someone else has a lot more control over housing than we do. And it's clear that, Missouri law really favors landlords when it comes to this issue. So the way that we can kind of help balance that power imbalance is build tenant unions and exercise tenant power. About 35% of US rents currently. So active tenant unions really help them equalize that playing field. Tenants are often, underrepresented among elected officials, and the power of having many people in our tenant unions can help amplify our voices in that type of dynamic. So tenant unions in Missouri have intervened on individual, community, and municipal levels. They've protected renters' rights by stopping evictions. They've won tenant protections, such as right to counsel. They fight for more equitable housing prices, and of course are working to allow tenants with housing vouchers more freedom to live in the communities that they choose, because there is a lot of discrimination when it comes to who will accept a housing voucher still. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and have Abby Ang talk about her organization and the wonderful work that they're doing there.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much to Empower Missouri for inviting Sheena and I to share with all of you a little bit about the work that we're doing in New York and why tenant unions are so crucial to the work that we do. Thank you again for the introduction, V. My name is Abby. I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator at Tenants and Neighbors. I have some slides that will be pulled up in a second that will go over who is Tenants and Neighbors as an organization, our mission, and most importantly, our strategy to how we win affordable housing and tenant protections in New York State. So I'll give a moment for those slides to come up. And I know after the presentation, there will be a chance to ask questions, which I'm very excited to answer. And I'm very happy to see that tenant organizing is spreading across the country. I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin. So I'm a Midwest girl at heart, even though I now live in New York. And so to see tenant organizing really bubbling up in the Midwest is very exciting to me. So I think you can go to the next slide. So who is Tenants and Neighbors? We are a members-led statewide center for tenant power in New York. Our board of directors is made up of tenants who came to us first with housing questions, became tenant leaders, started organizing their buildings, and now they help us run the organization, which I think is really cool. And we organize at the building and community level to preserve at-risk affordable housing developments, and we also coordinate broader campaigns for administrative policy reforms, because ultimately we want to build and wield tenant power in our state. So next slide, please. So our vision and mission, we believe that low and moderate income people should not have to live on the verge of displacement. And that's really why we focus on preserving affordable housing and for fighting for tenant protections. We do that through educating tenants and developing tenant leadership. And that is all to preserve the heart of New York, which is really diverse, livable communities. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our history. We were founded in 1974 out of a great need to protect tenants from landlords exploiting renters. And New York is really a renter-heavy state, and we're statewide. And so we organize both in New York City and across the state. Throughout our founding, since our founding, we've preserved thousands of units in affordable housing and have fought really hard for renter protections. In 2019, it was really exciting. We passed the historic rent law reform called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which made rent stabilization and rent control permanent in New York State and got rid of a lot of the loopholes that landlords would use to destabilize units. So huge win there that we fought for years. And that was through a statewide coalition that we coordinated called Housing Justice for All. We're still a part of that coalition, and we also do work with a lot of other organizations and coalitions throughout the state. Some of them you can see listed there. And we try to affect change on the local, state, and national level. Next slide, please. So a little bit of information about what our base is, who are we working with. We have approximately 3,000 low and moderate income tenants who are members of Tenants and Neighbors. And those include rent stabilized, rent controlled, and project-based Section 8 tenants primarily. Also some unregulated renters as well. But we really target tenants who live in that kind of housing in rent stabilized, rent controlled, and project-based Section 8 housing, because we view those models as really ways to provide affordable housing for people. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, I think. Okay, so I really want to focus here on our strategy because I know a lot of you are tenant counseling and social service providers. And so Tenants and Neighbors, we kind of have three or four main pillars: tenant counseling, organizing, leadership development, and then advocacy work. So we have a tenant hotline where people can call our office to ask their housing questions, whether that's maybe they're confused about a rider on their lease, or maybe their rent is increasing and they're wondering how they can fight that. I saw in the chat earlier that there are a lot of concerns about the conditions of older buildings in your area. That's the same here in New York. Landlords are extremely neglectful, and we have a lot of slumlords who are out of state and own a lot of properties and just don't invest the money to maintain those properties, and the tenants are left in these really awful conditions where there's mold or there's no heat, and that can lead to a lot of health problems. And so we get a lot of tenant calls just about like, what do I do? And so we connect tenants with resources. We don't have any attorneys on staff, but we'll make referrals to legal agencies or help tenants sue their landlord for repairs. And a lot of new members that come to us because of our hotline and our tenant counseling services. I would say a majority, if not all, of the people that I work with in the housing movement in New York State joined the movement because they had either a personal experience or someone they knew who really struggled with their housing situation. And so I think providing tenant counseling can really be a great entry point into more advocacy and more power building, which leads me to kind of our second pillar, which is building organizing. We have a few organizers on staff who work very closely with tenants to establish sustainable and democratic tenant unions, or as we refer to them at Tenants and Neighbors, tenant associations. And like V went over, tenant unions are really just when tenants get together with their neighbors to try to negotiate with their landlord. And we always say that one tenant, it's really easy for a landlord to ignore them and ignore their needs. When you have a lot of tenants together, they become much harder to ignore. And so it's a really important component of our work that we help form these tenant associations. And we want to make sure they're sustainable as well, because it's a lot easier to organize when there's an immediate issue, much harder when things get better. And so, but you never know when another issue might come up. So you want to create a structure in the building that allows for continued community building and organizing. And ultimately, we want to shift the power dynamic that exists between landlords and tenants. In order to assist some of that building organizing work, we also offer a lot of leadership development resources. So we will provide workshops and like one-pagers and fact sheets and 10 steps to organizing your building, like things like that, to help give tenants an idea of like, how do I even get started and why is this important? We also have a rent stabilized leadership committee and a HUD tenant leadership committee divided up between the different types of housing, because there are some different rights and regulations for different types of housing. And so those committees, the expectation is really that they are coming regularly to meetings. They're helping us plan workshops because tenants understand their issues the best and understand what they need. And at Tenants and Neighbors, we want to be able to fill that information gap. So our tenant leaders also recruit their neighbors to join in the housing movement, to go to Albany. The picture you see there is when we kind of took over one of the local legislators' offices. So we couldn't do any of that without our tenant leaders. And that also leads into kind of the advocacy component. So we don't just want to like perpetually be organizing these buildings and dealing with all these terrible conditions that landlords let happen or make happen even. And we want to change the system that allows that. And so we are fighting for a lot of different bills at the moment that will strengthen tenant protections and allow tenants to organize without the fear of retaliation. So next slide. So to give you some insight into our current campaigns, as I mentioned, we're a part of the coalition called Housing Justice for All, which is statewide. And there are a couple bills that I just want to point out. And maybe you're familiar, or maybe could be ideas for something that Missouri is interested in. The first bill is called Good Cause Eviction, which would protect tenants if a landlord basically tries to evict them for no reason, or if the landlord tries to raise their rent unreasonably. And this really is an important defense that tenants can have in court, especially if they're unregulated. We're also working on something called the Housing Access Voucher Program, which would basically be a state-funded Section 8 type program that would also include undocumented people. And then lastly, we're working on something called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which would allow tenants to put an offer in for their building if it goes up for sale or if it's being foreclosed. And that's really a pathway to convert privately owned properties into more community owned properties. On the city level, we're organizing tenants to fight for a rent freeze. So the way that rent stabilization works in New York is that every year there's the Rent Guidelines Board, which is appointed by the mayor. They vote on what kind of lease adjustment tenants will face in the upcoming year. And so around the hearing time, we organize tenants to testify and fight for a rent freeze, which you can see one of our tenant leaders doing there. And then most recently, we've been working on mobilizing tenants to the polls. And I truly believe that we can't do our advocacy work in a silo and not do also some electoral work, because ultimately we pass legislation when we have elected officials in office who care about our issues. And next slide. So now I will pass it to Sheena to talk a little bit about what's going on in her building. She has firsthand experience about what it's like to start a tenant union from scratch. They reached out to Tenants and Neighbors after a fire in their building and after their landlord refused to make much needed repairs. And so kind of like, as I mentioned before, that tenant counseling component of our work became the entryway for Sheena and her neighbors to start a tenant association or a tenant union. So I'm very pleased to introduce Sheena and have her share more about her story.
Hi, thank you, Abby. And like Abby said, we formed our tenants organization in response to a fire in our building. And, you know, I can share with you what the process has been like in our building and how it has helped us to file lawsuits and to force the landlord to make repairs. So when we had the building, the fire in the building in November, we all met and commiserated over like our indignation, anger, and concern about management just keeping us in the dark about what was happening. And so we weren't really sure how to navigate next steps, even though we were meeting and there were people had all kinds of organizational skills, but we just didn't know how to navigate. And so our approach was twofold. One of our neighbors reached out to Tenants and Neighbors in support of how to move forward. And then one of their organizers helped us to form a tenants association because it just never occurred to us that could be the best approach. But with some guidance, we were able to form our TA and elect board members. And then the second thing we did was we contacted Manhattan Legal Services, and they provide legal services on housing and tenant rights, among other things. So the organizer from Tenants and Neighbors helped us to draft a demand letter, which we presented to management with the intent to strike if our demands weren't met. And some of our demands were related to the fire, like replacement of apartment doors and windows and the public spaces that were damaged by the fire. But we also used this as an opportunity to address some of the long-standing neglect by the owners to respond to the issues of safety and repair concerns that we had prior to the fire. We also held a press conference that the organizer, her name was Brittany, helped us to pull together to lay bare the details of the landlord's neglect and the harm that it was causing. And, you know, it was a very successful strategy. We had lots of news organizations represented. We had some of our council members and elected representatives, and as a response, in response, we started hearing more from the management. Like they just began to respond to us, not necessarily in like meeting all of the repairs in a timely manner or effectively, but we began to hear from them. And then the second level that we were working to hold the management accountable was to contact the Manhattan Legal Services. And so they submitted a case on our behalf to Housing Court to, one, stop yearly increases in rents, to seek an abatement based on management's neglect to address repairs before and after the fire, and then finally to have all outstanding repairs and violations addressed in a mandate by the courts. So where we are today, right, on our organizing front is that, as I said previously, like we have more open communication between tenants and management, and they are making repairs, although some tenants are faring better than others. We're repairs are concerned. And those tenants happen to be folks that are part of the TA board, which speaks to Abby's comments about like having just if you're one person by yourself, that the management that they can ignore you. So with our being more vocal, they began to address our concerns first, and we still weren't really sure how much they were addressing our neighbors' concerns. So that's something that we're still struggling with, trying to figure out like what's really happening. And then on the legal front, we did get, we got a few court dates, but the owners have been purposely dragging the process out with legal shenanigans, like, or I don't know if they're legal or not, but like not showing up with everything they need to move forward to have the case move forward. And so right now, our latest court date, they did not show up. The lawyer didn't show up in person, even though it was an in-person court date. They showed up on Zoom and requested more time to consider whether or not they would be able to complete all the repairs in 3 weeks. So we don't have a court date. We just have a date for them to connect again with the courts to see if those 3 weeks are enough. So they just keep dragging it out, and as a result, like we get really frustrated and worn down, and that's where coming together as a group helps, because where one of us is like done, we have the voices of the other our neighbors and board members to say, well, I can step in and I can take this over, or just again to commiserate until we are able to regroup and get back on course. And so finally, our tenants organization, where we are, like we just continue with our neighbors to connect with them, and so that we will be able to pivot to the next issue, because there will be a next issue. Like this has been happening since November, and they are just doing the minimum to satisfy violations or our demand letter, but we know that they don't really have any intention of really meeting our demands. So I'll end there, and just say thank you again for listening.
Absolutely. Abby, Sheena, thank you so much.